Hello, in this discussion, we will examine Congress and the use of force using HowellPevehouse's 2005 IO article as a framework. In this discussion, I will disproportionately focus on the literature review and the research design. I do this intentionally so that we can focus on specific aspects of article reviews to help complete those assignments. Obviously, all the material outlined in the rubrics are necessary for completion for the assignments as well as exam prep. We think about the research question, how can Congress shape the use of force? The authors argue that they can sway the public, they can influence funding, and there are reporting requirements that they can place on administration. So there are mechanisms for them to do it. They then turn to the literature review. How to conduct a literature review? It's important to remember that scholars select the articles that are necessary to establish the basis for their argument. I typically think about this in terms of your favorite multi-movie series. Think of your favorite multi-movie series. Now think of someone who wants to watch movie 3 but didn't see movie 1 and movie 2. What do they need to know to step in and be able to watch the third installment? That's the literature review. The key pieces are, think of them almost as the key characters in that discussion, in that movie series. What we do in scholarship is identify those. Now, I use the use of force so that we can identify how the use of force, our understanding of it, has changed over time, how questions arise and get answered and then addressed by others, and it allows us to look at different sections of the federal government as it relates to foreign policy. When we think about this article, it sets up and reviews the literature much the way that it's outlined in this course. They discuss Ostrom and Job. They identify that it set the research trajectory, that domestic factors influenced decisions to use force. They examine James and O'Neill. They mention the international threats and the severity variables. They have a couple sentences dedicated to Fordham, looking at the macroeconomic policies and that presidents only see opportunities when economic conditions are poor. They mention also there's a conditional effect at play in Fordham. So those three pieces, that which we've read 2 of the 3, help prepare us to understand the use of force. It also tells us that Congress is missing. In each of those, I don't know if there's even control variables for Congress. They also, as good scientists, include contrary evidence that suggests, Mirnick's argument and work suggests that only outside influences determine the use of force. Well, if that's the case, some of the mechanisms identified in the article may not apply. The scientific method almost necessitates contrary findings and opinions as we start to learn, not really opinions, but findings, as we start to learn about a topic. So do not take this article or any single article that we discuss in class as what I would call big T truth. Now, it may add to our understanding and it may be supportive, but no single academic article is the whole story on an issue. This is why we get news reports that tell us that drinking red wine is the same as exercise, or eating chocolate is the same as exercise. Well, maybe one study found that, but we need to look at the samples, we need to look at replication, we need to be critical of the scientific process that produces those reports and those insights. So why is Congress weak? Congress is weak in foreign policy and the use of force. I would argue by what I would say is Sunday morning quarterbacking. The authors articulate it this way in a quote: Congress cannot or will not try to constrain the president's freedom to pick battles, define the scope and duration of conflict, or set the terms by which a conflict ultimately is resolved, end quote. In the use of force specifically, the president has, many would argue, a more free hand to take action for his or her preference, or for their preference. That we kind of see play out. Think of presidential actions when it's the use of force. There are plenty of them, and they are consistent. We think about the mechanisms, in addition, that underline the use of force. First is a mechanism here, we think of them in social science as the method and the process dynamic that generates the observable outcome that we are studying. Diversionary use of force to switch the view of the public to either get them to be distracted or to show competence in foreign policy that can be leveraged domestically. If this is real, if it's real, it typically only happens under poor economic conditions. Well, Congress is more likely just to go along with the use of force at that point. What about the rally around the flag? And this one we do know is real. We think about major foreign policy events, and there is upsurge in what some would call nationalism or patriotism or devotion to country recognition. I think easily in the United States, the most recognizable one over the last 20 years was 9/11. If you look at the public opinion poll of President George W. Bush before and after and immediately after the event, I think he jumped into the low 90s in public approval. Probably almost doubling or something like that from where he was. That's a rally around the flag effect. Well, the same assumptions would apply. Congress is weak. So there's little investigation necessary from scholars in those instances because the president will then be the person taking action. Now, there is more scholarship since this piece came out that looks specifically at the Senate and the House in terms of elections, in terms of vote behavior and foreign policy, and individual legislators can and are held accountable for their foreign policy votes and those outcomes. The authors would argue that Congress is important because it can dismantle a president's military venture, it can convey political resolve, and it can move public opinion. So the next is the crux of when it applies. And it's only 2 paragraphs in the paper, but it's hugely influential. When will Congress take action? So this paper does not universally say, oh, Congress is constant force, or they always take action, or they're a check on the president. No, that's not what they argue. They argue that there are 2 conditions that need to be met before Congress is even willing to engage in this discussion. First is at the perceived costs of the use of force. You are more likely to have interbranch government competition as the intervention intensity increases. So another way to say that is, as the foreign policy or the use of force intensity increases, larger use of force, larger potential blowback, larger potential electoral consequences, the more likely Congress is going to take action, or there will be interbranch competition. Next is that presidents are not likely to go head-to-head with Congress in the beginning. Presidents are anticipatory about how Congress will view something over the duration of the intervention. So we can't just simply say when an intervention starts. We have to think strategically about potential outcomes. Partisanship. The authors argue that if opposing the president occur, it usually is going to occur in the opposition ranks, which makes sense. So if you have a Republican president, who's most likely to oppose that president? Democratic senators. If you have a Democratic president, who's most likely to oppose that? Republican senators. Let me say it right. Well, there are 3 arguments for why partisanship of Congress matters. The bottom 2, we're actually going to go 3, 2, 1. Curry presidential favor. If you are a co-partisan, or for example, you are a Republican with a Republican president or a Democrat with a Democrat president, presidential favor can matter. They can help you with re-election. They can help with campaigning as well as campaign financing. It's beneficial, typically, to have the president on your side if you're from that party, typically. Next is that you often have shared electoral fortunes. Frequently, you will see, especially not in midterms, but in presidential elections, frequently, if a president from one party does well, that party does well. If the president is doing poorly, then that party typically will do poorly. The one I want you to make sure that you understand and review thoroughly is the content and credibility of signals. Now, I'm not going to go through this because I want you to pull from the reading. If you have questions, you can email me about it. Pay special attention to credible information. When are signals between the president and Congress especially informative? Make sure you can answer that question. All right, so the research design, I'm going to take care of that because this is no joke, is like number 17 trying this, and sorry, I corrected that, and I'm not going to edit that out. We think about the research design. The dependent variable, use of force. It's quarterly. It's an extension of the examinations that we have, but it's updated. So we can now compare multiple pieces over multiple times on on what determines presidential uses of force. Which one's most influential? How has that idea evolved? That's something to keep in mind. Okay, now they have a couple, they have three, I think, explanatory variables, independent variables. There's unified government. Is it all controlled by Republicans with a Republican in the White House or Democrat with a Democrat in the White House? They have a percent of presidential party. So especially in the Senate, the number of people in the majority can influence cloture and other types of vote. And then they also have a measure, because of some of the complicated changes that have occurred in electoral politics, of presidential party power. And then they have a host of controls, many of which you should recognize are consistent in other research that we've examined. So in terms of research design and controls are not there simply haphazardly because we think this may influence it. That's not how science works. There's evidence to support, even if it's not significant sometimes, that a variable is important in ensuring that we're examining all the causes and consequences of an outcome. Okay? So we think about unemployment. You can directly tie the use of unemployment with previous literature when it was the key explanatory variable. Next, we think of what are the results? The results are different for major and minor uses of force. So I want you to think critically about the difference in results of Table 1 and Table 2. Table 1, nothing significant. Nothing. Why is that so important? Think about the two paragraphs that we discussed about when Congress is likely to take action. Congress is not likely to take action if it's a minor use of force because it doesn't meet the thresholds. Now, if you turn to Table 2, major uses of force, HowellPevehouse's evidence and their arguments seem to be supported. That means when those thresholds for congressional intervention do occur, Congress has an influence on the use of force. I specifically want you to take a look at the substantive effects on page 222. The interpretation is straightforward and is a good example of how to make research less archaic and very approachable. When we think about the results, I also want you to think about robustness checks and why do we have them? What does that mean? A robustness check is typically in a quantitative article, re-estimation of the main models and the main findings using different data, different operationalization or coding of the data, or identifying different time periods, different estimators. Why do that? Well, the reason we want to do that is we want to have confidence in the statistics. We want to have it examined from as many ways as possible to ensure the accuracy and the support for the results. In this particular replication, or robustness, I want you to look at the War Powers Act results. So they have a whole section. They have a section on Vietnam. They have a section on time periods. They have a section on presidents. And they have one with the War Powers Act. They use, and I quote, cannot reject the null hypothesis that the slopes for the two periods are equivalent, end quote. What they're saying in this context is that the War Powers resolution did not alter congressional influence. What? They passed this to control the use of the president in actions, but at least in this article, and it's only this article, there isn't evidence to suggest that the War Powers resolution makes a difference. Well, yeah, something to think about. That's the importance of replication. So for example, if major legislation gets passed and you don't account for it, and that changes the effects, that's why we do robustness checks. And then finally, why do they use MIDs? MIDs are a different measure of the uses of force, and they're trying to do that to, again, see if their results hold. So to conclude on this, they do find that partisan support to use force abroad is significant when it is a major use of force. Partisanship and Congress matter, It matters more when it matters when it's a major use of force, and partisanship of Congress and the president makes a difference. So, one conclusion from that is it does matter who Congress has in office and who the president is. Here's discussion question 4. Cut and paste this into the discussion question 4. Answer the question. When I say provide links to news/information, I explicitly mean apply links to sources that support your argument. That's it. Thank you.